This is a short video about housing codes and how they impact small homes, particularly houses on wheels. This video is produced by smallhousesociety.org at resourcesforlife.com. Hi, I'm Greg Johnson with resourcesforlife.com, home of the Small House Society, and this is a short video about housing codes in cities and how that impacts the placement of smaller homes on wheels. In my previous video on this topic, I spoke a little bit briefly about housing codes. It was really just kind of an introduction to this topic. That was a few days ago, and there have been over 400 people who've watched that video and commented. I apologize that the quality of that video was not so good. I just recorded it as I was walking on my way to take the bus home. So there's a lot of background noise and motion, and I had some requests to post something fresh. So I want to provide you with two things in this short video. First of all, just share a little bit about my experience living in a small home in Iowa City. And then when I'm done with that, that'll take a few minutes, I want to show you on the internet how to actually look up housing codes, and I want to show you specifically what the housing code says with regard to these tiny homes. Okay, so first of all, as some of you may know, back in the summer of 2003, I worked with Jay Schaefer to build a tiny home that I called the Mobile Hermitage. It was 10 by 7 and with an upstairs loft, 140 square feet, I suppose you could say. So I wrote a book about that experience, what led up to it, and how that changed my life. And the book was called Put Your Life on a Diet, Lessons Learned Living in 140 Square Feet. You can find out more about that by going to putyourlifeonadiet.com. Anyway, so from 2003 August to 2009 August, I lived in that tiny home in Iowa City. For the first year and a half or so, I had the home placed on a property in really a kind of an out-of-the-way spot. It was behind some bushes and trees, hard to see. But as the home got more media attention, people were seeing it, not as they drove by, but on the front page of newspapers and through other media outlets. So eventually, unfortunately, somebody in the Iowa City area, actually who lived, way on the other side of town, they complained about the home, and they apparently had received themselves, they received a parking ticket because one of their tires of their car was on their own land, and they got a parking ticket for that. So they were frustrated to think that somebody across town had a home on their property, and they felt this was a violation of city code. So at that point, once there was a complaint, the city had to do something. And I received a legal notice stating that the home was not in compliance with city code and that it had to be moved. So I pursued this with some people who were at the city housing office, and apparently the main point of law was the fact that the home was on the east side of a property, and that was a corner lot. And so according to the law, this tiny home on wheels was in the front yard, or at least a front yard. So any yard that faces a street is considered a front yard. And that was what made it illegal to have the home in the yard. But in working with the city, we determined that by moving the house to the west side of the property, where there was no street, and it was not in a front yard, then that would be perfectly legal as far as a place to put a tiny dwelling on wheels. There are some other issues, though, regarding what these small homes are basically referred to in the law, as you'll see later in this video. These small homes on wheels are like RVs. They're considered temporary dwellings. Okay, so a temporary dwelling is a dwelling that is not built on a foundation. It's a dwelling that is not connected to water or electric or sewer or any kind of services from the city. And that's considered a temporary dwelling. It could be a tent, could be an RV camper. And the law in Iowa City states that you cannot have anyone living in one of these dwellings for more than, I think it's 45 consecutive days. We'll look at the actual legal code coming up here in a minute. But so that was a completely separate issue. So two issues. One, where can it be placed? And there are laws that address that. And then number two, if somebody's going to be staying in this tiny house, how long can they stay there and what kind of service is going to be hooked up? Well, as I got some advice from people that work with the city, they said that as long as it was placed legally, and actually I had to put down some cement blocks, could have been a slab or any kind of a surface, but it needed to be on some sort of firm surface. It can't just be parked on the grass. And that's true for, whether it's a car, an extra car, vehicle on the property, or an RV. You can't just leave vehicles on the grass. They have to be on some kind of surface. Well, anyway, I put down some blocks that I got from the construction, Menards in this case, and put the home on that. So that took care of the placement issue. With regard to staying there for an extended period of time, like in my case, 6 years, there really is a complication there, and that is that the city cannot assign somebody 24 hours a day with a clipboard to watch, am I sleeping there every night? As a practical matter, the law is something where you're really on your own to really comply with that law, because nobody else can enforce it other than the person living in a tiny house. And theoretically, you could stay there for some days, stay for one night in a hotel room, and then come back again. The law now, currently, I think it states that there's a certain amount of time you can stay in a temporary dwelling in a calendar year. So, but there again, it's really almost impossible for somebody to keep track of when is somebody staying in this space. So, unlike other zoning laws, which are, when violated, kind of obvious, if somebody's setting up a business in a residential area, you're going to know that pretty soon. Or if somebody's building onto their home and they're building right up to the sidewalk, for example, or some other obvious zoning code, that's easy to track down. But other things like this matter of, how many nights are you sleeping in this tiny house, that's hard to track. So I'm going to go now to the actual web page that describes what the law is. I think you'll find this interesting. And if you have any more questions, I appreciate all the feedback from the previous video. And if you have any more questions, feel free to comment on YouTube or through the website resourcesforlife.com, and I'll make an effort to respond to those questions as they come in. So thanks so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. As with many things in life, you can go to google.com and find information about anything you have a question on. And in this case, I'm going to go to Google and search for Iowa City Housing Code. You'll see the top link here will take me to the Iowa City government webpage, where I can find information about the housing code. And what Iowa City has done is they've linked to a third-party website, which probably makes some economic sense if you can have a third-party host and maintain your city code, and presumably based on some sort of template that other cities are using. I think Iowa City's probably tweaked their own city code with, you see human rights here, and there's even information about administration, adoption ordinances, and other things. So we're going to go down to Title 17, which has to do with the Building and Housing Code. And particularly if we scroll down here and look at definitions, I find that that is the most informational and interesting section of this before you dig any deeper. So we'll click on definitions here. And some slides later that I'm going to post in the video will actually zoom in a little bit on some of these definitions and give those to you in a larger font so they're easier to read. Just kind of scrolling right now, and certainly you can go to the website and do what I've done here to read the details about Iowa City's housing code, which, as I say, is pretty much similar to the template any other city is going to use for their housing code. But something that relates to small housing, and particularly particularly homes on wheels, is you'll see here that a dwelling is defined as any building, structure, or manufactured housing except temporary housing. So there's an exception. All of the other rules relating to, housing code, they relate to dwellings. But if you have a temporary house, then that has a different set of rules that govern it. And you can see temporary housing is a tent, trailer, motorhome, or other structure used for human shelter, designed to be transportable. And it states here also you can only live in one of these dwellings for 21 consecutive days and not more than 45 days in any calendar year. Now, in my case, the city was kind enough to let that stretch a little bit. Instead of 45 days, I was living in my tiny home for 6 years. So, each city is going to have their own willingness to bend the rules a little bit. I want to cover some key terms relating to housing code. And first of all, I want to take a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, as it relates to housing. And it states in Article 25.1 that everyone has a right to housing. Obviously, it doesn't go into housing codes, but it states that everyone has a right to have a dwelling of some kind. I know that it went by pretty quick, so I want to provide you with the URL for the Iowa City Housing Code. It's icgov.org/default/?ID equals 1182. That'll take you to that page. And as I mentioned in the video previously, that the link on that page will take you to sterlingcodifiers.com, where you'll find codes for municipalities all over the country. You can see the map here, and it allows you to click on a state and then provide your city name. And presuming the code is there, you can go right to your own city code. There are some points in the Iowa City Housing Code that I want to take a look at. Under minimum structure standards, you'll see safety is item A. Item B is kitchens, and interestingly, you have to have an approved kitchen sink and space for a refrigerator and a stove or range. Of course, toilets, baths, and lavatories are all required in a typical dwelling, and water heating facilities are specifically detailed in terms of how much heat they produce, and there's also information and guidelines about connecting to sanitary facilities, water, sewer system, etc. Exits. Every structure must have at least one exit. Well, I think you'd have to have that just to get inside of it. And interestingly, there's a section about requiring natural light in a home, ventilation that is required for safety reasons, and even under point 2 here, you'll see natural ventilation is written into the code. I'm going pretty quickly through these. Heating guidelines, but you can see it, and this is just, some of these are just excerpts that go on and on. And electrical requirements are pretty detailed in terms of what's required there. And minimum space, use, and location requirements, which I find very interesting, because it's here where the city states that there should be 120 square feet or more for each person, and of course that's the first person, and then 100 square feet per person after that, which actually seems kind of tiny even by the Small House Society guidelines. If you can imagine, 4 people living in something that's just 420 square feet, that would be a tight fit. And what's ironic about that is that elsewhere in the housing code, there are minimum size standards whereby there would never be a home that's 120 square feet, because the minimum size standards require that it be, I think, 700, 800, or 1,000 square feet. So anyway, it's interesting, though, that there is a provision in the city housing code that states 120, 100 square feet of habitable space per person, that's just fine. Anyway, let's move on to the rest of these slides. And many of these guidelines are very practical, and I think anyone considering building a home, even if it's a tiny home that doesn't need to meet some of these guidelines, could benefit from just reading through the housing code to consider what they might want to include in a home. This final item, fire protection, of course, would be important to have in any home. But all of the guidelines I just read actually do not apply to tiny homes on wheels for the reasons I'm about to mention. Let's take a look here at the definition of a dwelling. So as you'll see here, the laws about dwellings only apply to dwellings and not to temporary housing. Temporary housing is defined as a tent, a trailer, a motorhome, or other structure used for human shelter and designed to be transportable and not attached to the ground. So tiny homes on wheels then fall into this category of temporary housing, and therefore do not they're not restricted by all of the housing codes that I previously just outlined briefly. You will see, though, that there is this provision, at least in the Iowa City law, stating that you cannot stay in any temporary housing for more than 21 days consecutively and no more than 45 days in a year. So again, as I stated previously, I was really happy that the city of Iowa City let me go a little bit beyond that 45-day period, and I was able to stay for 6 years in my home and finally moved into a 360 square foot apartment. But really of no, there was no pressure put on me to make the move by the city. But I have to say that it did feel a little precarious to me to be staying in a home that was clearly, in violation of this city ordinance. And so eventually I just felt prompted to, until the law changed, to find some other housing situation. And, also as I was sharing the small house experience with people, I found many people who said, if it wasn't so tiny, I think I could do something like this. So, if I had been living in an example of a small home that was 400 square feet, 300, 500 square feet, in that range, with a kitchen, with a shower, with a bathroom, I think it would have drawn more people to the idea. But because it was essentially in violation of the law and so small that there was no, shower or full-size kitchen, a lot of people just couldn't accept it as something for them, And for that reason, I felt it wasn't the strongest, action that I could be taking to inspire people towards smaller living. I thought it might have been, pushing the envelope a little bit too much and making it seem, unattainable. There's another category of dwelling that I do want to comment on, and that is accessory building or accessory use structure. And these are also called accessory dwelling units in some cities. So this is kind of another category where people might have a studio out in their backyard. It needs to be under the same ownership as you see here. But basically these studio buildings that are not on wheels but physical structures on a foundation, they kind of fall into this gray area that allows people to use them as guest houses. But if you investigate this a little further, you'll find that the city code does not allow these accessory building structures in most cities. They're not to be used for long-term habitation, and so they don't meet the requirements of a habitable structure. So I think if you're interested in finding out more about housing codes, you can use those resources that I mentioned in this video, or go to smallhousesociety.org. We have a lot of resource pages there and even some online discussion groups with Yahoo and Ning and Facebook. This video was recorded using an Apple iPhone 4S and edited using iMovie 11. The screen recording was done using QuickTime 10, and slides were made using Keynote.